Joshua Lewis here with Remnant Radio. Thank you so much for tuning in today's show. We're talking about divorce and remarriage. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. I want you guys to stay tuned throughout the whole conversation because this might be something that you've never heard of before as far as the different views here. I really want you to kind of be patient with us as we're fleshing out all of this content. But before we get into that, I want to let you know who we are as a channel. Remnant Radio is a theology broadcast. We interview pastors and teachers every single Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. And we interview pastors from Anglican backgrounds, Presbyterian backgrounds, Baptist, Pentecostal, non-denom, the whole gambit. But our goal is to really look at the scriptures and challenge our presuppositions so that we can know God's word better and, in fact, know the God who has given us his word. So if you're blessed by this ministry and you want to help us continue to make content like this, there is a link in the description for giving. But maybe Michael can tell us a little bit about some of the other stuff we've been doing here recently and stuff we have to look forward to in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So last week we had a great conversation with Eric Metaxas about Martin Luther. He allotted us 30 minutes, and then he gave us longer than 30 minutes.
He's a saint and a scholar.
Great conversation, and by the way, great book, biography on Martin Luther. But yeah, check out that interview. That was last week. We talked with Dr. Joel Bierman from Concordia Seminary, talking about Lutheran soteriology. So it was Week of Luther last week. And then Josh and I did an episode on the value of human life, the Imago Dei, the image of God, in light of especially what's going on with racial tensions in America right now, and honestly around the world. Is this thing in the aftermath of George Floyd has gone global. On that note, we do have tonight Ken Fish coming in, and he's going to talk about the way the Bible has been used historically to actually promote racism, looking at the sons of Noah and how in America that was used to actually promote racist ideas, and much broader than that. He's going to talk about Moses's black wife and how he's criticized for that, and so on. So
wait. So people understand. He's coming on to tell us how the Bible has been used incorrectly to prove racism.
Yes.
Okay.
Did I not say that?
No, you just said he's just going to show us how people have used the Bible to be racist.
Used badly,
okay,
right?
Here we go.
Okay. Yes, used badly.
Let me be clear.
Thank you. This is why we have a two-person show. Okay. So, but Ken Fish, and he's been on the show several times before, and everybody always loves it when he's on. And then on Thursday, we have Scott Mcknight on the show, and has a great book called The King Jesus Gospel, and so we're going to just talk about the contents of that book and the nature of the gospel itself. Really going to be powerful.
Yeah, and before we have David introduce himself, I want to remind everyone in the description of this video, Dawson has done research for the subject of divorce and remarriage. If you want to really study into it, get some of the language, understand some of the historical background and context, that would be something for you. At this very moment, that link is not in the description of this video, but it will be shortly. So once this video goes off air, I will put it up on the website and then drop it into the description of the video. Without further ado, David, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Which, by the way, he has told us to call him David and not Dr. Instone-Brewer.
Right. Tell us a little about yourself and your ministry before we dive in.
Well, I'm British, as you can hear from my voice, and I understand that that puts my IQ up at least 10 points in America.
Yes, it does. You can narrate any documentary here.
Yeah, but it also makes me into a villain in most of the movies. It's always an English villain, isn't it? I'm a researcher here in Cambridge. I work in biblical studies, particularly in the languages, and I've managed to stay a researcher all of my professional life pretty much. That is, I stayed a student. I kept on learning. And my particular interest is Jewish background of the New Testament. So my friends are the rabbis of the days when Jesus was calling them all hypocrites. But I find that a lot of them are quite nice people as well. There were some nasty hypocrites there, and Jesus was right to call them hypocrites. But some of them, they're nice guys, and they interpret the Bible. And that gives us a lot of insight into how Jesus was speaking and what he was speaking about and what he was correcting. So I also work with the Dead Sea Scrolls and also Greco-Roman background to some extent. So I like to look at the world of the New Testament and try and understand it through the eyes of the first people who read it.
Okay, so I think what we have to kind of look forward to today, for those of you who are watching, Nicholas, you're correct, wasn't scheduled far enough in advance. I don't know if you guys have seen this in the background.
Look at all the floating triangles.
The floating triangles. This is not our set, right? Someone else is using this space and gear and equipment and just haven't had time and resources to make sure that we properly promoted this video. So you guys do us a favor, grab the link to this and share it on your Facebook and social media stuff so we can get this out here, because we didn't do a whole lot of time promoting it up front. But that being said, on this conversation, what you have to look forward to in the dialogue is we're going to be, first of all, talking about why this conversation is important, right? Pastorally, David's been a pastor. He'll be able to kind of give us a little bit of insight on why and how these conversations take place, what we need to be, what our heart posture needs to be in this process. And the next thing that we want to do is we're talking about the definition of divorce and remarriage. What do these words actually mean, and how should we interpret them? We'll look at some Old Testament texts, and then we'll look at the New Testament text with Jesus and Paul. So that's kind of what you have to expect in this video. Let's go ahead and start with that. I want to call you doctor every single time. I'm sorry. David, tell us a little bit about why the conversation of divorce and remarriage is really, really important.
Well, it's important to me because when I went into church, I'm a Baptist minister, I found so many people coming to me and saying, hey, can we get married in your church? Because the church down the road won't marry us. You know, the Anglican Church, the Catholic Church, Brethren Church, they just won't marry us because I'm divorced, or we're both divorced, or there's some other problem in our marriage. And will you marry us? And suddenly I had to think, I'd better read the New Testament again on this issue. So I was expecting so much of this. It was a rather nice building we had it is a suburb in Cardiff, and it was a nice building to get married in. But yeah, you had this easy pushover pastor there who was going to marry anyone, wouldn't he?
Yeah.
So I had to get back to the books and study this issue. And I found when I opened the New Testament, having spent 3 years doing a PhD in the ancient rabbis, I was reading Jesus' words in a different way. And suddenly the texts which were problematic before, which were quite inscrutable on divorce, suddenly they made sense because I was reading them like a New Testament rabbi. And yeah, that was my eureka moment.
Okay. So can you maybe contrast for us, maybe just give us some of the traditional interpretations of the New Testament passages on divorce and remarriage that were originally kind of like making you pull your hair out, trying to really wrap your mind around, and then kind of the revelation that came that followed.
Sure. When you look at the Gospels, it looks like Jesus is allowing divorce for one reason alone. And he says they appear to be saying to him, hey, is there any form of divorce that's okay? Because they say, can we get divorced for any cause? And he says, no, not at all, except for maybe adultery. And then when you get to Paul, he says, no, you can't get divorced at all. You can't separate unless there's an unbeliever who separates from you. And both of them have just the one reason why you can get divorced. Well, if they both have only one reason, they're both contradicting each other. And of course, the church does a fudge and says, oh, well, yeah, we've got the one reason for Jesus and we've got the one reason for Paul, and that gives us two reasons. But that kind of ignores the fact that Jesus is saying there's only one reason. And Paul, too, appears to be saying that. And then that one reason is only adultery. And you think, well, what about those poor people who are being abused in a marriage? Those poor people who've been abandoned? What happens with them? Does Jesus not care about them? We have one of the early church fathers saying, what if my wife is poisoning me or poisoning my child? Can I divorce her? And he says, no, of course I can't, because Jesus said that I can't, but it's tough. So they're very big practical problems. And then there's just the language problem, where it says if you get divorced and then remarry, you're committing adultery. Well, that's okay, but the language doesn't make sense. Adultery is something that you commit against someone that you're married to. And if you're divorced and you get remarried, you're only married to one person. How can you be committing adultery against someone you're not married to anymore? So had big problems with the texts.
So when you define marriage, in talking about the definition of marriage, do you look at marriage as, and there are some people who define marriage as a contract that takes place that doesn't end until one of them die, right? Like there is no grounds for divorce. Define for us marriage. How exactly would you define marriage in a kind of contractual term? I think even when I listened to your interview with Dr. Michael Heiser, the conversation was like a lot of people in the West seem to view marriage in kind of this spiritual bond, something that's not real concrete in its contract. Can you describe to us what marriage would be?
Yeah, I go back to the ancient Near East because the Bible itself doesn't actually define marriage for us. Very frustrating. Right. But you can understand because everyone knew what marriage was. So why define something that everyone understands already? In the ancient Near East, you were married to someone if you took vows of marriage with them in public. If you didn't do that, she was your concubine. But when you took vows with her in public, that means with witnesses, then you were married.
So common law marriage, concubine.
Yeah, if you're living with someone, concubine. And it's a very similar legal setup as well. Concubine you can get rid of at any point. There's no legal consequences. If you have children with a concubine, you can keep the children. There's no way the law can say that the concubine can take the children with her. Very
it sounds
similar.
A little bit more like a little bit more shady than like your significant other. Like today would be like your husband, your wife, or significant other.
Does the Bible have a word for significant other?
He's like, the word the Bible has for significant other is concubine. You know, so
right,
yes. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Does that
see how your significant other feels about that phrase?
Does that apply to both men and women? Out of curiosity, because I've always heard of women being referred to as concubines, but can I refer to a man? Because I've got a guy in mind that'd be like, bro.
You're a concubine.
No.
And the men had the upper hand in that sort of situation, and I think they still do. It's it's a legal mess.
I love that we have David Instone-Brewer on from the UK so that you could ask whether or not you could call your male friend a concubine.
Well,
okay. Well, so speaking of like definition of marriage, so let's touch on the one flesh component. You know, Genesis 2:24, they shall become one flesh. This is obviously a big component of it. And then when you get to Matthew 19, he references that again, and he says the two shall become one flesh. So speaking to that, because you also, what made me think about it was when we talk about concubines or living together in the modern context, Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, if you just sleep with anyone, you could become one flesh with a prostitute, which it's kind of like, whoa, I thought the one flesh thing was a marriage thing, but now you're saying you can go around and just one flesh yourself with a bunch of people. Like, can you speak into that?
Oh, well, the one flesh obviously is a euphemism for sexual contact. And as Paul says, if you're going with a prostitute, you're really messing things up. But my mother taught me, mothers, they teach you things like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, or my mother always taught me, read the small print. Mm-hmm. And that's what you ought to do in a marriage. You read the small print, because when you get married, you're actually signing a contract. And when you go out, when the music's playing and they go out to sign the papers, that's serious papers they're signing. And when they're speaking their vows to each other, those are serious vows, because those vows are legal words they're speaking to each other. Okay. And the Jews had very serious vows. They promised that they would be faithful to each other, and they promised that they would feed each other, and they would clothe each other, and they would make love to each other. And that was a contract, and the lawyers were very keen on those terms.
Okay. I want to come back to that in just a moment, because you were quoting from Exodus chapter 21. But I want to speak into just kind of to follow up on the one flesh component, because this would be the reason I ask is it's a major sort of linchpin of a largely traditional understanding of divorce and marriage, and that is that basically sex both makes and breaks the marriage contract, right? So hey, when you make love to your spouse, you are consummating the marriage, and so that's sort of like a sealing of the deal of the vows that you once made. But then since Jesus allows in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19 for sexual immorality as sort of like an exception clause to the marriage contract, as an allowance for divorce in such a scenario, although I know you would agree that it's still best to pursue reconciliation, but he does allow it. And so, like, it's just the idea that, like, hey, well, the marriage vow has been broken through sex. It was made through sex. Can you speak into that sort of traditional understanding for a moment, from your perspective?
Yes. The rabbis, they said something which is still true for us, that there are three things that make you get married. There's the sexual component, then there's the money. Remember when you exchange rings, you're exchanging some goods? That's the tiny, tiny bit left in our marriage services where you're exchanging the money. But without an exchange of something of value, there's no contract in any law. And of course, there's the vows. You have to be making promises to each other. And those three things form the marriage, not just one thing or the other. You can't get married just with vows or just with money. You have to consummate the marriage. You have to have all three. And that's still true today.
Yeah, so I'd love to ask about the texts in Exodus that we have discussing divorce and remarriage. Before I direct you to answer that question, we're going to do a quick word from our sponsor, and then we're going to get back into the Old Testament. How does the Old Testament describe divorce and remarriage? So be back in 1 sec. Hey guys, the song you're listening to right now is from StoneBridge Worship. Now, StoneBridge is sponsoring this episode of Remnant Radio, and last week they sent us a Dropbox link to this full album. And I'm telling you, this album is awesome. It's edifying, the quality is spot on, and if you haven't checked out StoneBridge Worship, just go over to your Spotify channel and type in "Worthy is Jesus." That's the song you're listening to right now. The song is amazing. And if you don't have Spotify, man, go check out their YouTube video link. I put it in the description of this video at the bottom. You can watch the full music video that you're watching right now. And another, big thank you to StoneBridge Worship in sponsoring this episode of Remnant Radio. Hey, I see a lot of good questions in here as I'm reading through the comments. Lots of really great questions. People who've gone through divorces want to know, hey, what's right about this? My husband left me. I've been told I can't get remarried. Another individual in here who's talking about his wife who left him. Another person in here is dialoguing about the idea of mixture of any kind after marriage is in fact adultery. So hey, we're going to dialogue with you about this. We're going to ask some of your questions to Dr. Instone-Brewer, which he told me not to call him, but I'm gonna do my best here in a few moments. But before, we want to really lay a good foundation for this conversation. So we want to ask a question about Exodus 21 with the first 10 verses in there.
Yeah, I think we'll just read.
Pick it up and read it here.
Yeah, so I think the most relevant two verses are Exodus 21 verses 10 to 11. But just so you guys have some context, it's Exodus chapter 21 deals with slavery. Not slavery as we understand it in the UK or America, is really more like indentured servitude. But the first 6 verses talk about basically male slaves or male indentured servants, and then verses 7 through 11 talk about the female, and particularly one. And Dr. Instone-Brewer, you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but particularly a female who is sort of like a slave bride, and sort of her rights, and the section is meant to protect her rights. And so with that understanding, verses 10 through 11, it says, if he, sort of like the master husband who's agreed to marry this woman and has, if he takes another wife to himself, so he marries somebody else, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. So I hope I didn't explain too much. David, could you maybe fill us in just one on the exegetical understanding of these 2 verses?
Yeah, well, as you said, this is talking about something which doesn't exist in our society. It's a woman who was a slave and got married to her master. They hit it off very well and decided that she would marry him. And then he decides to marry someone else, and this was perfectly allowable in Mosaic law to have more than one wife. And it says, well, yeah, that's okay, but you mustn't neglect your first wife. You mustn't neglect this slave wife. And it says exactly what you mustn't neglect. You mustn't neglect her food. You mustn't neglect her clothing. And this rather coy phrase, you mustn't neglect her marital rights. It's a rather rare word, but I guess that's about right. It's the sex side of things. And the rabbis said, well, this doesn't just apply to a wife who was an ex-slave. If it applies to someone that low in society, obviously someone higher up in society also has those same rights. And they said, if a woman has those rights, then obviously someone more important than a woman, i.e. a man, also has those rights. And so everyone in marriage had those rights. They had the rights for food, clothing, and love. And they said the man has to supply the food that gets cooked. The woman does the cooking. The man has to supply the cloth or the money to buy the cloth, and the woman has to make the garments and the bedding. And they both join together in love. So everyone had that. And to us, it's an obscure verse, but it was written into every single marriage contract we can find before the end of the first century, and also one past the first century. So
this was liberating for women at that day, right? Like other legal documents that would talk about marriage, or other documents that we have that talk about marriage in the ancient Near East, did not allot women these rights, especially slave women these rights.
Yeah. No, this was very special in Mosaic law, and it was very precious that both men and women had the right to say, hey, you're neglecting me. You haven't bought me any new clothes for a long time. I did some calculations on what the rabbi said that the men had to provide in terms of clothing. And, it says about how often they have to buy new festive garments. These are the special ones. And for a poor man, it amounted to about 1/6 of the man's income. So, things haven't changed.
That was a clever way of saying that.
Now you mentioned that third word of the three obligations: food, clothing, and some translations will say marital rights or conjugal rights, and you say it's an obscure Hebrew word. I think it appears once in the Old Testament manuscript. Now I understand some interpreters or commentators understand this to be a reference to oil, but it seems like most do understand it as conjugal rights. So I'm curious about the difference between those two and how we settle on the one. And then also I know some commentators, scholars understand it to be more like not so much are they giving each other's bodies enough sexually to like satisfy each other's sexual needs, but more like are they more conjugal rights in reference to like the bearing of children, that like he can't deny her the right to children, that kind of deal. How would you understand, how do you settle on a meaning of that third word, marital rights or conjugal rights?
When you're looking at it in the ancient Near East, it's very difficult to determine what the meaning is, because as you say, it only occurs once, which is unfortunately true of an awful lot of words in the Old Testament. And there is a phrase in the ancient Near Eastern literature, food, clothing, and oil, because these are the three things that you need in an arid, hot society. Oil is something that you have to put into your skin, otherwise you just crack up and get ill. So because that phrase of those three things occurs so often, people have proposed maybe that obscure Hebrew word means oil, but it really doesn't make sense in that context. And certainly we know that when you have New Testament times and everyone has it in their marriage contracts, they understood it as marital rights. So in the contracts, they usually use euphemistic language. They'll say, you have the right to my bed, or you come into my house, and so that sort of language.
Right.
And as to what it means as a lawyer, what do you actually have to do to fulfill your rights? That the lawyers were very specific. They said you had to do your marital duty, and they said how often you had to do it. So if you were a trader, you had some donkeys and you went trading with them, well, you only had to do your duty every month or so, because you might be off on a journey. But if you're a normal person, you had to do your duty once a week. But if you are unemployed, you had to do your duty every day.
That
for
checks out.
scholars.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Unemployment benefits? Should we call?
Dang.
Sorry.
Wow.
Was that off color? That
No.
probably. I don't know.
Yeah.
Keep going. Come on,
I'm gonna keep going.
Okay, so when we're dialoguing about, we're almost halfway through the interview here. Let's dialogue a little bit about Jesus in the New Testament. It seems as if Jesus comes on the scene and he is in the midst of a hot debate between two different, or maybe even three different groups, depending on how people want to count it, of individuals who have an opinion about marriage. And there's this long, heated debate around the time of Jesus' life. They ask him some questions, maybe give us some understanding of the historical backdrop before we even get into some of those texts.
Yeah, well, just before the time of Jesus, a generation or so ago, before, there were two rabbis who disagreed about everything, Hillel and Shammai. And Hillel very cleverly found a new ground for divorce. The four grounds for divorce that exist in the Old Testament are unfaithfulness, of course, from Deuteronomy, and from Exodus you have the neglect of food, clothing, and love. But Hillel found a new one, because he said, hang on a minute, in Deuteronomy, where it says about unfaithfulness, it says, ervat devar, that's a matter of nakedness, or nakedness of a thing. And he said, you only need that first word, nakedness, to mean adultery or sexual immorality. So what's the second word doing? And the second word is just a thing, a cause, devar. So, yeah, Moses must be saying there's another thing which you can get a divorce for, and he's not saying what it is, so it's anything. And they call you divorce the any cause divorce, the anything divorce. So, and one rabbi even saw Kiva, he said, and let me tell you what those sort of things can be. It can be a new wrinkle on your wife's nose, or it can be an unburnt dinner. That's a thing. And then suddenly you can get divorced very, very easily at the drop of a hat.
So by the time of the first century, people are getting divorced for literally any cause. It's divorce run rampant, and so they're asking Jesus, what you're saying in Matthew 19, for instance, they're asking Jesus to take a side in this debate. Correct?
Yeah, there were two sides. As I said, Shammai always disagreed with Hillel. It's a bit like Republicans and Democrats. If one side says one thing, the other side has to say the opposite. And Shammai said, no, it's not two things. There's only one thing in Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 only allows divorce for sexual immorality, and that's it, one thing. There's no divorce except for sexual immorality in Deuteronomy 24.
Wow. So it's almost like the debate that's happening today in the church.
So I'd be. I know we said we'd take one step forward into the New Testament. I'd like to take a step back now, because we were just dialoguing about how these are things that would give you legal grounds for divorce, and there are people out there who are saying no, there are no legal grounds for divorce, and even the most radical groups will say no, not at all, and others will say just sexual immorality. But and this is something that I'm picking up from your interview with Heiser. You kind of articulate God as being a divorcee because God married Israel, Judah, and
Judah, right?
And then divorces. So how do we interpret those texts?
Yeah, in Jeremiah, he says very clearly that God has divorced Israel, and Judah is in danger of getting divorced herself.
Yeah.
And in Isaiah, you have God saying, well, where's your divorce certificate? And there's clearly a language of marriage and divorce from God's side. And a lot of the prophets are trying to figure out how on earth is this marriage going to get together again? Because by the law of Deuteronomy, you can't remarry the wife that you've divorced. And so how on earth is God going to remarry Israel? How on earth are we going to fix this problem? And the different prophets have different solutions. But they're not afraid to call God a divorcee.
Okay, so how do we, so we have this Old Testament, Exodus chapter 21 passage that we've kind of established as a foundation. There's also Deuteronomy 24, which we've now touched on, verse 1, where it talks about the certificate of divorce, referenced later in the New Testament. So since you went back to the Old Testament, I feel like we should camp out there for just a moment. Could you, to help us get this foundation for understanding New Testament texts, could you help us understand what was the purpose of a divorce certificate?
Yeah, this was something which is very new in the ancient Near East. There's one society in the Middle Eastern laws where someone could get a divorce certificate if their husband was lost in battle, if she was married to a very senior military officer. And this certificate allowed her to get remarried, even though there wasn't a corpse and you didn't know whether the marriage was ended or not. And the point of the divorce certificate is to say, yes, the marriage is ended. And the wording that we have from very ancient times is, you are now free to marry any man you wish. By rabbinic times, that's the necessary wording on any legal divorce certificate. But it looks like that wording came from way, way back. The whole point of the divorce certificate is to allow the woman to remarry, so that he's giving up rights to that woman.
Okay. And in your perspective, does Jesus abrogate that in the New Testament when he says, well, Moses allowed this for hardness of heart, in Matthew 19, that he allowed for the divorce certificate because of hardness of heart? Is he thus saying, but that's no good in the kingdom, because in the kingdom there's no space for hardness of heart and divorce certificates? How do we understand Old Testament law and principles applied in the New Testament in the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah, I don't take Jesus as undermining the Old Testament. Jesus isn't saying, hey, my dad said this, but I'm taking over now and I've got a new law. Jesus doesn't abrogate the Old Testament, and I don't see him doing that. But he does tell us what it actually meant. And
That's good.
Jesus says, no jot or tittle of the Old Testament is going to be undermined or overturned. I'm standing firm on that foundation. So when he comes to divorce, he's saying, hey, these grounds actually matter. There are these grounds in the Old Testament, and you're throwing them away by having this any cause divorce. You're saying, hey, you don't need any real grounds. You can just get divorced. He's saying, no, that's not true. If you're going to rely on the wording of any cause from Deuteronomy 24, if you're relying on Deuteronomy 24, there's only one ground for divorce there. That's sexual immorality.
And so that's kind of a great way to lead into this. When we talk about divorce in the Old Testament, we often see these passages that say, hey, this is how you can get divorced. Then we look at Jesus. Jesus says, nope, New Testament, raising the standard of grace. I always hear that. Grace increases the standard, which I completely agree with you. I think that's ridiculous. It makes either Jesus more holy or more perfect than the Father who gave us his law, right? But in fact, they are in complete agreement with one another, and Christ is rightly representing the heart. So when the scribes and Pharisees are saying, he doesn't speak as one who's copying the law as a scribe. He's speaking as one who has authorship. He's got authority. He's speaking as if he's giving us the heart of the matter here. So love that. I love that Jesus doesn't contradict the Old Testament. But to that point, when Jesus is speaking on divorce and remarriage, how are we to understand? I'm kind of getting lost in my train of thought here.
There's maybe like how the Old Testament principles pull in that. Because one question I had,
Sure.
I'll jump in here for a moment, was why doesn't Jesus mention Exodus chapter 21 when they're saying, can we have a divorce for any cause? And he says no, except for sexual immorality. Why doesn't he go ahead and throw in Exodus chapter 21 and eliminate all doubt for us? Because I could imagine, and so I want to just speak for some of our viewers who might feel somewhat challenged by what you're saying or bothered by it. Hey, it looks like you're not studying, or not. No one would say that. It would look like you're not paying attention to the plain meaning of the text. Let's just look at the plain meaning of the text. Jesus says, except for sexual immorality. So that's the way we should understand it. And you're just importing all this other stuff. How would you respond to somebody who's saying that?
If we had a sort of someone from Mars come along and say, look at our marriage laws, and you see, oh, he's got a no-fault divorce. Oh, I see. He's so perfect. He had no faults. He was just unbearable to live with. That's why they got divorced. That's the plain meaning of no-fault divorce. When we think about plain meaning, we have to think about what the words meant to the people who were actually listening then to Jesus. And when they heard the question, is it permissible to get divorced for any cause, They knew that Jesus was being asked about the any cause divorce that was invented by the Hillelites. And when he answered, not for anything except sexual immorality, they knew that he was quoting the slogan from the Shammaites, who said that no, there's no any cause divorce, but it's all one phrase for a matter of sexual immorality. So that they hear those quotations from the debate that's going on, and for them there's no confusion. But of course, when we read it, we're not remembering that legal terminology, we're not remembering those debates, it's not live for us, and so we invent a new plain meaning of the words.
Right. Okay. Awesome. So so let's jump into just your 4 allowances for divorce. You've got for sexual immorality, and I guess you would put neglect, so the food and clothing, and it seems like you put neglect and abuse, like, hey, if neglect counts, then abuse counts also, and then conjugal rights. Is that how you would word it as the 4 possible reasons for divorce?
The way in which Old Testament law works is that you define the least offense, and then anything more important than that, anything greater than that, obviously that applies. It's like we define battery, assault and battery. We say laying a hand on someone inappropriately, and so when they're not wanting it, it's battery, and anything worse than that is certainly battery. So in the Old Testament, you allow an ox to feed when it's treading the grain, and that's the least animal, and therefore any employee is allowed to benefit from what's happening in what they're working on. And so Paul says, and therefore a minister should be paid. And this is how the rabbis recognized the Old Testament, and it's how we recognize the Old Testament. So when it says that someone should be allowed to have food and clothing and love, and if you neglect that, it's also talking about things that are worse. And abuse is worse. It's way off the spectrum, way off the scale, way beyond neglect. Abuse is, it's you don't. It's like saying, it says I'm not allowed to hit someone, but murder's okay because I just use a knife.
Right, and then I think to your point, that's kind of where I was going with talking about Christ and the Old Testament, New Testament, is that when we look at the New Testament, in particular after the resurrection, we see Christ enacting a people of God, a royal priesthood, a holy nation of God's people. But in the Old Testament, we also see the commandments that are being given are laws. They're legal laws for people's sin. It's not to say this is how I want you to live. It's to say that you are a sinful people. There is a government that is going to rule and reign over you, and this is how they're to interact with people in their marriages. So how do we understand kind of the legal should Christians look at the Old Testament laws? Like, for me, for instance, I look at those texts legally speaking and say, yeah, it would technically be just for a person to divorce their wife under these kinds of grounds. That being said, personally, I'm holding myself to the moral obligation that we have become one flesh. Is it okay to separate the moral requirements that Christ has given us from the legal requirements that he gave the Jewish government, the people of Israel with their governmental system?
Yeah, certainly it's very different now. We take the Old Testament as a moral guidelines, and because Jesus has taught us to do this, we apply them very, very rigorously. But remember, we don't throw away the Old Testament. We have no law saying in the New Testament saying there should not be rape. Right. And Jesus didn't need to teach that because everyone agreed on that. There's nothing to say that wouldn't every youth leader in the country want Jesus to say clearly that you shouldn't have sex before marriage? But Jesus didn't need to say that because, hey, everyone knew that. They knew that from the Old Testament. And so we don't throw away the Old Testament. The Old Testament's still important and still the basis of what we believe. But it's not a law in the same way. And Jesus does hold us to a higher standard. And he says you should keep those vows. You should keep those vows of supplying the needs of your wife, of your husband, and of being faithful. And if we did keep those vows, there would be no divorce. There's no reason for divorce at all. And Jesus would not allow any divorce unless there were Old Testament and New Testament grounds for divorce. No divorce unless those vows have been broken.
That's great. Let's get practical then for a second, because when we talk about abuse in particular, I'd love to talk about abuse just briefly, because when we talk about abuse today, we live in a culture where if I say words that you don't like, it's considered harassment or verbal assault, right? Then in other cases today, within the culture here in the West, if I don't speak out about certain issues that you think I should speak out on, that is also considered violence, right? So if I speak, it's violent. If I don't speak, it's violent. We live in a culture here in the West where these terms of violent, neglect, abuse, these things are just kind of ambiguous terms. Can you help give us some clear defining ideas of when we understand what is abuse, what is violence, what are those kinds of things in a marriage?
Yeah, and could I add in there what is neglect?
Yeah.
Because I think to me neglect is the mushier term because neglect is kind of like my husband neglected to kiss me goodbye, or to use it feels like a slippery slope.
My wife neglected to put enough mashed potatoes on my plate.
Because David, I know that on one hand, your strong interpretation is, hey, any cause divorce is wrong, but like the any cause divorce in the way was it the Hillel that defined it that way, the any cause divorce? Anyway, but I know that. Back in the day when you wrote an article for Christianity Today, and John Piper followed up and had a strong response, and I think you followed up to him as well. But it was basically over this idea that, like, hey, if you open the door for neglect and abuse, and we don't clearly define these, it feels like a slippery slope into any cause divorce. So how do we define neglect and abuse?
Yeah, that article I was cut down to just so few words, and it was very difficult to have a nuanced expression of what I was saying. And it's very clear to anyone who reads my books. And John Piper had read my books, so I was disappointed by the way in which he was misrepresenting me. But the Jesus, when he was asked about these things, he didn't start defining terms, and not like the rabbis, they did do things and defined exactly what neglect of food and clothing and love were. And I don't think we should. I think we should go along the same ways that Jesus did when he said, no, if there's going to be a divorce, it's for hard-heartedness. In the Old Testament, this is a word that doesn't exist in Greek except in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. It's the stubborn continuation of sinning hard-heartedly, sinning hard-heartedly. And you find it in two places in particular, but it's Jeremiah where it comes up in the context of divorce. And there it's Israel who is sinning hard-heartedly, continually committing adultery. And God lets it continue for 7 times 70 years before he calls an end to that marriage. And Jesus is saying, yeah, divorce is allowed, but for hard-heartedness. When there's continuing going on of these breaking of vows, and it gets to a point where continuing the marriage is just multiplying sin. It's not continuing any sort of love. Divorce is there for hard-heartedness, not there for the first fault and you're out.
Right. Okay. So then you would see those reasons, neglect, abuse, conjugal rights, sexual immorality, not as a one strike you're out, but really like those are branches of a hard-heartedness where they become sort of like a repeated behavior or something like that. Is that kind of how you would say it?
Yeah. If a person says, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, and please let me make it up to you, you've got to accept that. But of course, eventually, you may see it as just a pattern. They're just saying, hey, forgive me, and it's not real. But from the outside of a marriage, we can't judge that. It's only on the inside you can really judge what's going on.
So those individuals get kind of their own say-so, independent from government, independent from the pastoral council of their church, independent from their congregation, to make a divorce based off of, I feel neglected and I have voiced my concern within our confines with just me and my husband as our witnesses, and So an individual it becomes individualism at that point when it comes to divorce, or is there a group of individuals who get to participate in making that decision?
As a pastor, I would always say, hey, let's try harder. Let's
Yeah.
try again. That's the role of the pastor and the role of the church, to be friends to both sides of the marriage and to be their partners. They've attended the wedding probably, and they've promised to help this couple, and we should always be on the side of the marriage. But if one of them gets to the point where they just can't survive inside that marriage, then we support that. And we support that person who's coming out, and that person who needs help, maybe as a victim, maybe as the perpetrator. And we need to be supporting both sides there. And it's not for us to judge. We don't have a system where we judge these things. We're not not lawyers. We're not a government, and we are supporters.
I love that. I love that you said as a pastor, and then Josh, for you talking about just kind of in the community, because I know I'm a pastor too, and for me, I always like if somebody in my congregation comes to me and says I'm getting a divorce. I mean, it always breaks my heart. No matter what the situation, it breaks my heart anytime I hear of it. But it really breaks my heart if they tell me that and I haven't been involved at all, and no one on my pastoral team has been involved at all on any part of the journey. Because I mean, I think one of the huge scriptural messages is we do life in community, and I think a marriage is kind of set up for failure if it's in total isolation. So I like the way you guys are talking about the role of community, but at the same time, to your point, David, you can never know fully what's going on in somebody else's marriage. So now let's say, okay, there's been hard-heartedness. There's been let's take one of those categories. Let's take the neglect category. Okay, there's been no sexual immorality. The other spouse hasn't died, but there is neglect, and there is a divorce as a result of the neglect. Can the victim of the neglect then move on to marry somebody else, or else how do we understand Jesus's words where he says, "Hey, if you're divorced, you can't get remarried"? So let's talk about remarriage now.
Yeah, well, Jesus was talking to a crowd saying, look, your new ground for divorce, any cause, it's nothing. It's invalid completely. And most of the people in that crowd would be there with their mouths open, because that was the most common reason for divorce. That was the most well cited. Remember when Joseph was wanting to divorce Mary? He was going to do it without a fuss, without going to the lawyers, in order to save her blushes. And the only way he does that is by using a no-fault divorce. He would have lost financially by doing that, because he wouldn't have got his ketuvah back. And he was doing it to save her face. But it was such a normal thing, and he's counted as a righteous man for doing that. Most people in that crowd of Jesus would have had someone in their family who'd been divorced for any cause. And Jesus is saying, that's not a biblical divorce. You are not divorced. And if you remarry, you're committing adultery, because you're still married to that former person. You're committing adultery against your former partner by going in with someone else. And whoa, that's a headline that everyone is going to be talking. Jesus says there's no divorce unless that at any cause was for adultery. And
and then Romans 7 is a text that I constantly hear being quoted. And forgive me if, as I was reading through here, if you addressed that as I was reading some of these comments. But Romans 7 says, hey, a woman is married to her husband, and she's bound under the legal commands of that marriage until her husband dies, and then she is free from that marriage. If she's to go off and to get remarried or to live with someone else, she is an adulterer. So help us understand the context of Romans chapter 7, speaking of an illustration of how Jesus was to die on the cross, and by dying on the cross frees us and then raises from the dead to marry a new and better covenant. So in that text of Romans chapter 7, how should we understand coming to individuals? Maybe get real practical with us. People who have come from a divorced marriage, and they're coming to us and say, hey, I want to get married. And as pastors, we're looking at this situation going, am I allowed to remarry these people? Are there certain grounds on which you wouldn't marry people? So maybe let's start with Romans chapter 7 first. How do we understand that? And then the follow-up question to that would be, do you have certain grounds on which you wouldn't remarry some people?
Yeah, Romans 7, as you summarized, you've got the person who's married to the law. All the Jews who were married to the law. They had to obey every single command in order to be saved. And of course, that was impossible. But how do you get out of that deal? How do you get out of that covenant with the law? And the only way it would happen would be through a divorce. But of course, the law is never going to break any of the vows it's made. The law is a law. And so the only way out of that is through death. Death ends a marriage like a divorce ends a marriage. But if you're dead, then you can't. Then you're dead. And Jesus comes along and says, "No, I'll die for you." Mm-hmm. So death comes and ends that contract with the law, and we can then be part of the bride of Christ. But that isn't saying that that's the only way a marriage can end. It's saying that's the only way that marriage to the law is going to end. Mm-hmm. But the marriage to a fallible husband or wife who does sometimes break the law and who may break the marriage vows, that can happen by divorce as well.
Okay. And David, how would you understand the weightiness in your mind of traditional church interpretation and just the way we understand the scripture? Because I could imagine somebody saying, hey, it sounds like you're valuing what the ancient rabbis say rather than what the ancient church is saying. And shouldn't we follow the church's historical record of the church has either not allowed for remarriage or only allowed for it in a very small percentage of cases?
It won't even give you communion.
Won't even give you communion, the Catholic Church. Yeah. So how would you understand sort of what the ancient church has said versus what ancient rabbis have said in understanding our own interpretations for today?
Yeah, I'm not following what the Jews say as something that we should follow. I'm only saying following what the Jews say in order to understand what Jesus is saying to them, to correct them. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm interested in the ancient Jews, to understand what the New Testament is speaking into. But the early church did have the same misunderstanding that we do, because they didn't know the legal jargon either. And it's interesting that actually the rabbis at the same time in the 2nd and 3rd century, they were starting to forget that legal jargon. You have a very interesting discussion between two rabbis where they're saying, well, what is it that the Shammaites say? Well, they say you can only get divorced for adultery. And they didn't, of course. The Shammaites and the Hillelites agreed that you could get divorced for neglect of food, clothing, and love, and they helped to define how much. Well, of course, they disagreed about how much. But they too believed that. And it's interesting to see how quickly legal jargon goes out of date. In my childhood, we often had, I come from Brighton. Brighton is a sinful city. It's the place where you go for your dirty weekend. And often in newspapers, it'd be that so-and-so's got divorced because of a liaison with his correspondent or correspondent. Do you understand what that means?
Yes.
Yeah. But it's not part of normal jargon. It sounds like you've got a divorce because someone had a pen pal. Mm-hmm. Correspondent. Yeah. But in my youth, correspondent was often in the newspapers, and but now it's legal jargon only, and it's you very quickly forget what things mean, and it's a terrible pity that the church did forget so quickly. But the early church wasn't always right. The early church taught that you could.
I mean, you're a Baptist. You don't believe the early church was right on baptism. I mean, I'm a Baptist. That's why
I'm a Baptist, and so I don't take that much notice of the early church. It's the Bible only for me, I'm afraid. That's right. That's a disability, perhaps. But the early church was already teaching that if you sinned after baptism, you could not be forgiven. So Constantine wouldn't be baptized until his deathbed. The early church isn't always right.
Right. And I'd be interested. I've got a couple of comments here in the video description that I would love to get some of your thoughts on. One of our audience members is asking about, it's John Barnes. Can my wife divorce me if I repeatedly commit the offense of looking at pornography. We have other questions in here as well, but I'd be curious to your thoughts, because the word for sexual immorality is used porneia, which certainly we get our word pornography from, but it's really more of an umbrella term that just says all kinds of sexual immorality, as it's been used in multiple contexts and places. So for things like pornography that are plaguing Christian men all across America, are these grounds for biblical divorce?
Yeah, it wouldn't be grounds for a biblical divorce at all. Porneia, as Jesus was using it, was a translation of the Evat in Deuteronomy, and everyone was understanding that to be sexual immorality, adultery, committing adultery
A physical act
with a physical person. I know a lot of people do interpret porneia in a very wide way, and let them do it, but that's not what the Bible says.
Next question, Justin. It's not really a question so much, but Justin is saying that he has been living with his wife for, I want to say, he says he's got a 6-year-old son. They've been together for 7 years, but they don't have no contract. They haven't made any vows publicly. How would you pastor an individual who comes to you and says, hey, we're not married physically, me and my wife. We're not married in the traditional vow exchanging process. We have children together. By the state, we're considered common law. We made some kind of quippy one-liners at the beginning about, what was the word? Not harem. What was the word? Concubine. Yeah. So and that was, kind of jesting. But how would you address pastorally kind of a situation like this?
I would always counsel for people to get married. You don't have to have a wedding. Weddings are expensive, but a marriage is just $100. You go and get married. And if you are worried that the relationship won't last, that's a double good reason for getting married, because it gives legal rights to your partner, which they won't necessarily have if you don't get married. So I would counsel get married.
So if they're saying like, hey, in the Bible, it seems as if the two become one flesh, that this act of monogamous sexual relationships, this is marriage. And I'm looking at the text, I'm looking at the scriptures. I see no formal process of marriage. I see no marriage ceremony. I see no text when you get married. These are the things that you should proclaim to your spouse, and they should proclaim these things to you. So you're just kind of inventing marriage. I see the text that says when two people come together, they become one flesh. We're married. Adam and Eve didn't stand up in front of, that's actually a pretty good argument. I'm making this up on the spot. Adam and Eve didn't, make public declarations to people. They were the only two people there.
But there were talking animals.
Oh, they were talking animals. Well, okay. So the koalas witnessed the marriage ceremony, but help us understand some of that.
As you said, in the Old Testament, there were people like that, and they were called concubines.
Right.
There wasn't anything wrong with being a concubine, but you didn't have those legal protections. And I would ask someone who didn't want to get married in that way, why? Why don't you want to get married? Is it because if you split up, you don't want your partner to get any money? Is it
That's not respecting them very much. Got it.
Is it because you don't want to recognize the state and you don't want anything from it? In which case, you won't have any welfare, you won't have any Medicaid. What's the real reason for rejecting getting married?
Right.
That's good.
Now, another practical question. This was one of our viewers way back in the show, and I couldn't even find it in the comments, but they were basically saying, what if I got married and regretted it? Like, I feel like I chose the wrong person. Is this grounds for divorce according to your criteria?
Well, when you get married, you say some pretty serious vows. And the point is, you're supposed to mean those vows. So you think carefully before you say those vows.
Right.
And you may not be happy in that marriage, but that's not necessarily the point. Especially when there's children there. You don't just split up and leave those children without two parents.
Right.
So getting married is a very serious thing. And, but if there is abuse, if there is adultery, if terrible things happen in a marriage, God doesn't say you've got to stay there and be damaged by it. God does allow for sin to be real, but he calls us personally, me personally, not to be that sinner, and we should not be breaking our marriage vows.
So I have a question about the pastorate. I think that there might be actually more practical questions for people who are watching. I don't think every person is a pastor. So I would love to ask that question. But Michael, do you have any kind of follow-up questions for?
That's good.
Okay,
Jump in.
great. Pastorate. Okay. 1 Timothy, qualifications of an elder, husband of one wife, a one-woman man, they saith. I hail from a denomination that hail being born.
I thought you were going to say, I am a one-woman man.
I am a one-woman man, first of all. Secondly, the denomination I was raised in, they would say, hey, if you were divorced at any point in time, let's say before you came to faith, you were divorced maybe after you became a Christian, any of those kinds of situations, you could not pastor, you could not be an elder under these situations. What say ye?
The phrase the one-woman man occurs twice, and also the phrase the one-man woman occurs once. And it's the one-man woman that would have been recognized immediately as a phrase that everyone knew. You often see it on tombstones, the univera, the one-man woman. And it is the woman who was devoted to that one man and was faithful. But you never saw the phrase that Paul used, the one-woman man, because Roman men didn't stick to one woman. When you were about 14, your parents would give the boy a ring with an erect phallus to remind him to go and sow his oats, to go and get some experience.
How nice.
Yeah, nice. There's lots of them around. So it's not always on show in the museums. And when they're married, it doesn't stop. You can continue going to the brothel. If you have a mistress, your wife is not supposed to complain. There's no such thing as a one-woman man. And Paul says the church is completely different. In the church, no one can be a leader of the church unless they're standing up to this high, very high moral standard in those days, because it was completely opposite to what their own experience was. And he said you had to stand up to that high standard. You have to be a one-woman man. But that's got nothing to do with divorce and remarriage. That's to do with faithfulness within that marriage, being a one-woman man.
You know, Deacon James commented on my statement about Adam and Eve. Did you see that?
No,
Deacon
I
James,
didn't.
he's barely Protestant. That's his
Okay.
actual name. Well, not that his name is Deacon. Neither here nor there.
Talking about usernames on our amongst our viewers.
Amongst our viewers, we actually know their personal names after getting to know them on YouTube here for a while. But he was talking about how Adam, in fact, did make a vow to Eve, and it's recorded. So we're all the witnesses. That's pretty clever. Okay. Anyway, so I super honored. Do you have any follow-up questions? Any kind of?
You know, I mean, we could talk for hours on this
Sure.
subject, and because there's the exegetical and theological, and then there's the practical, and those questions just go on and on.
right.
Dr. Brewer, could you tell us just your Instone-Brewer, or David, could you tell us your website so that people can just can access that in case they have further follow-up questions? Your website, your book.
Divorceremarriage.com has lots and lots of question and answer things, and also lots of resources. And the book Divorce and Remarriage in the Church is there as a full text on the website for you to read for free. Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible is the one which has all the technical stuff. All the Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic, they're all translated, so you don't need to be an expert to read it. But all the texts are there, all the backgrounds, so you can become an expert. Divorce and Remarriage in the Bible.
Awesome.
That's good. Let's do some closing thoughts. Just kind of go around. I'll start with Michael here. David, we'll have you. Then just kind of what are some closing thoughts? People are walking away. What do you want them to be thinking through, praying about, really wrestling with as they finish up this video? I'll start with Michael so that you have some time to think of what you would want someone to walk away with.
Yeah, you know, you use the word wrestling with, and I think that's the right phrase because, I mean, it's a lot of what Remnant Radio is really about is wrestling through hard to talk about issues. And this is huge amongst issues. I saw one of our viewers talking about, hey, I'm getting emotional just listening to this. And so we know that this is a very emotionally charged discussion, and there's a lot of church tradition behind it, and it's something that's hard to talk about with any degree of nuance, and so that's what this whole discussion is about. Just a couple of other things I want to say. You talked about how God is a divorcee, how God is a victim. Considering how emotionally charged this is, I think that's super important for us to think about, because if you are divorced, Jesus is not like standing up on his ivory tower saying, "You terrible person." Jesus, being God in the flesh, knows what it's like to be divorce. To be a divorcee. He knows what it's like to be rejected by his lover, and so, as our sympathetic high priest, he empathizes with you, and so I think that's one thing to understand about this is Jesus isn't just like, spouting off moral decrees. He's coming to us as one who's really suffered himself in this. The Lord is, and so. And then the other thing I would say that Jesus is like, we tend to think of him as like anti-divorce, and I think that is true. I mean, Malachi says, God hates divorce, but I think most of all, God is pro-marriage, and I feel like if we put all the emphasis on the anti, we miss really the heart of it, that marriage is about a loving relationship. We're pursuing each other. And I like what you said, David, about the hard-heartedness component, because it's not about one strike and you're out. Like, even as a pastor, when there's sexual immorality involved, when there's an affair involved, I always counsel reconciliation if at all possible. And I think that looking at the relationship between Christ and the church, we should always be reconciliation first. Wherever we fall on the issues and how this all plays out and the chips fall, I think we need to be on reconciliation first, marriage first, and divorce if it must be. I'm not gonna,
It's good.
But marriage first.
Good. David, what are your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'm. When Jesus was asked about divorce, he didn't actually start answering for several verses or for several minutes or even an hour. I don't know how slowly he spoke through things. We have a very abbreviated account, but he's speaking about marriage. He didn't want to talk about divorce. He wants to talk about marriage and how to keep it going and how important it is that it stays going. And my wife and I, we've been married for, I hope she's not listening. Is it 35, 38 years? I can't remember exactly.
30 some odd years.
Yeah, 30 some odd years. And we're now going on a marriage course because, hey, the church is advertising its marriage course. Let's see what we can learn about this, because marriage is something that you want to keep working at. It's not something that just stays in place and works automatically. It's something you have to work at, and you've got to be able to continue learning how to talk to each other and how to work through those difficulties, and marriage is worth it because it's really gives you strength by being a strength to each other. But it takes work.
That's really good. Hey, just my encouragement to you guys would be, when people around you are going through divorce, there's not an opportunity to push them away as someone who is less Christian, less holy, and unpure, but it's an opportunity to embrace. The Bible says that we're to mourn with those who mourn, and there is not a more mournful season in a person's life than divorce. I know people who have grieved less over a death of a spouse than the divorce of a spouse. When we talk about divorce, it is a horrible thing to see anyone go through, children in particular. As an example, we have invited families into our home. There was a family in Illinois that we were pastoring. We saw them come to faith, stop drinking, wearing longer clothing, dressing more modestly, cleaning up their language, that kind of thing. And then they moved to Michigan, and we moved back to Texas. While there, he got hooked on drugs again and spent all of their money, struck his wife. There was horrible things happened. I found out on a Facebook post as they're kind of sniping at each other over the Facebook post. They both moved in with me and my wife with their kids, and we cared for them for 6 months until they were able to restore their marriage. They were in a place of destruction. They were in a dark place. No one was feeding into them. This is an opportunity for Christians to surround people, embrace them, and see restitution and restoring of marriage, because it's a beautiful thing that the church should fight for. It is a representation. This is, and I would encourage people, you going through it, it's always difficult trying to restore these marriages. But again, we've been in the process, probably in the last 2 or 3 years, have seen 2 or 3 marriages being restored, have had multiple families, or sometimes individuals live with us so that we can counsel and be with them in this process. So I would just encourage you guys who are out there listening and watching to remember that when people are in pain and people are in suffering, no matter whether they're right or wrong, that is a command for the church to get involved, to care and love people through that stuff.
Amen.
So that's my encouragement. Let's do
Love
that.
it. Love
Cool.
it.
We'll see you guys tonight. Kinfish, 8:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. We're talking about how the Bible has been used inappropriately to encourage racism. That's how you say it.
That's how you say it.
You can't be like,
Anyway, it's
we're
going
talking
to
about
be
racism
it's going
in
to
the
be a
Bible.
great show. David, we are so thankful to have you on the show with us. We really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, it's been
All right.
great being with you, and you've, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, guys, like, subscribe.
That's right.
Yeah. Subscribe to this so you can make sure that you're in touch, and you can mark that you want notifications on YouTube whenever we have a show. It looks like a lot of you guys hopped on live for the show, so that's awesome.
Lots of people.
So thanks, guys, so much. Have a great week.
See you next time. Blessings.